One leader publicly dismissing a neighbor he claimed didn't matter, another leader being elevated by the world's second-largest economy. And the contrast wasn't accidental, because this visit wasn't about symbolism, it wasn't about photo ops, and it definitely wasn't routine diplomacy. It was about power shifting in plain sight. And judging by the sudden irritation coming from Donald Trump, it worked. Trump stood before reporters insisting Canada was irrelevant. He said the U.S. didn't need Canadian products. He waved off trade agreements like they were favors Washington had outgrown. He talked about bringing manufacturing home, about building everything inside U.S. borders. At the exact same moment, Carney was being received in Beijing with full state-level treatment. That contrast matters. In geopolitics, how a leader is received often says more than what's written in a trade document. China didn't just welcome Carney, it elevated him. Carefully chosen language emphasized the importance of the visit. Officials repeatedly framed it as a turning point, a reset. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens when a country sees strategic value. And the message wasn't subtle. This wasn't just about Canada. It was about Washington watching from the sidelines as influence quietly shifted elsewhere. But the welcome itself was only the surface. This was the first visit by a Canadian Prime Minister to China in 8 years. That gap alone tells you something had changed. And the timing wasn't random either. China has been looking for partners who don't govern by threat. Partners who don't rip up agreements on impulse. Partners who value predictability. Carney represents that. He speaks the language of trade-offs, not ultimatums. He understands long timelines. And most importantly, he doesn't swing policy based on personal grievance. In a world trying to reduce exposure to U.S. volatility, that matters. Beijing's decision to elevate this visit signaled trust. Not alignment, not loyalty, trust. And trust is currency in global trade. For years, Canada was treated as an extension of U.S. economic gravity. Deals were filtered through Washington first. Pressure came easily because alternatives were limited. That dynamic is changing, and Trump noticed. When Trump waved off Canada and said it didn't matter, it sounded confident. But confidence doesn't need repetition. Anxiety does. This wasn't about cars. It wasn't about trade text. It wasn't even about tariffs. It was about leverage slipping. For years, Trump's strategy worked because Canada had nowhere else to go. The assumption was simple. Squeeze hard enough and Ottawa would eventually bend. Autos, agriculture, tariffs, threats. The U.S. market was too dominant to replace. That assumption no longer holds. When Trump said Canada needs the deal more than the U.S., he wasn't projecting strength. He was reacting to loss of control. When he dismissed Canadian manufacturing, he was signaling frustration that Canada was no longer trapped inside a single corridor. And once pressure stops working, the tone always changes. But that wasn't the most dangerous part. For decades, Canada's biggest vulnerability wasn't its economy or its industry. It was dependence. When pressure came from Washington, there were limited exits. The assumption was always the same. Canada could complain, negotiate, even resist briefly, but in the end, it had nowhere else to go. That assumption is now breaking down. Under Mark Carney, Canada has stopped operating from fear and started operating from choice. Europe has reopened doors that once felt symbolic but are now strategic. Asian markets that were previously secondary are becoming real alternatives. And China's decision to engage at the highest level signals that Canada is no longer viewed as an extension of U.S. economic gravity. This shift matters because pressure only works when a country is isolated. Threats only land when there's no backup plan. For years, Donald Trump relied on that imbalance, on the belief that Canada would eventually bend because the U.S. market was too dominant to replace. But once alternatives exist, the psychology changes. Negotiations slow down, ultimatums lose power, and leverage quietly erodes. Canada isn't abandoning the United States. It's doing something far more disruptive. It's making itself optional. Optional to pressure, optional to coercion, optional to economic intimidation. And once a country reaches that point, Control becomes impossible to reclaim. This is where the story starts to make people in Washington uncomfortable. And it's important to be clear about what's confirmed versus what's being discussed. Reports and industry chatter suggest China isn't only interested in selling electric vehicles into Canada. There's growing speculation that Chinese firms are exploring something much bigger: manufacturing footprints, battery supply chains, and long-term EV infrastructure built on Canadian soil. If that happens, the implications would be enormous. Canada would gain access to lower-cost, high-quality EVs. Thousands of skilled jobs could follow. Entire supply chains, batteries, components, charging systems would begin forming domestically. Canada wouldn't just be a consumer market, it would become a production hub. And here's the part Donald Trump understands better than anyone else. Chinese-built EVs produced in Canada would sit right next to the U.S. border. They would compete directly with American automakers on price, technology, and scale. Three areas where U.S. firms are already under pressure globally. That possibility alone changes the power equation. It explains the sudden irritation, the sharp language, the dismissive tone. Not because Canada is weak, but because Canada suddenly has options. And when alternatives exist, leverage starts slipping fast. For years, Canadian agriculture has been caught in the middle of global retaliation cycles. Canola, seafood, pork, entire sectors paid the price for political disputes they had no control over. Farmers felt the impact immediately, while Ottawa had very limited room to maneuver. The leverage existed on paper, but in practice, Canada was negotiating under pressure. That dynamic is starting to change. China knows Canada is no longer negotiating from a position of urgency, and Canada knows it doesn't have to accept permanent losses just to avoid escalation. Even small signs of movement on agricultural trade send a powerful signal. They show that retaliation isn't forever, and that relationships can be recalibrated without dramatic confrontations. This matters because agriculture is about stability, not headlines. When markets reopen, even partially, it restores confidence for producers who have spent years absorbing uncertainty. It also proves something more important: diversification works. Canada doesn't need instant breakthroughs to shift leverage. Incremental progress is enough. Each reopened channel weakens the idea that pressure can force quick compliance. Each alternative buyer reduces dependence on a single market. For Donald Trump, this is another reminder that Canada is no longer boxed in economically. And once that realization sets in, the old playbook stops delivering results. One of the biggest misconceptions surrounding this moment is the idea that Canada is choosing China over the United States. That framing is misleading, and it misses the real strategy entirely. This isn't about replacement, it's about protection. For decades, Canada's economic position left it exposed to the political mood swings of a single partner. When relations were calm, the system worked. When pressure arrived, options disappeared. Trade threats became leverage. Uncertainty became a weapon. Under Donald Trump, that vulnerability was pushed aggressively, often in public and without warning. What Mark Carney is doing now is fundamentally different. He isn't tearing down relationships, he's widening the field. Europe isn't a symbolic backup anymore. Asia isn't a distant option. China isn't a taboo conversation. Together, they form something Canada hasn't had in a long time: breathing room. That breathing room changes everything. A country with alternatives doesn't panic when pressure appears. It doesn't rush into concessions. It can slow negotiations, absorb short-term friction, and wait for better terms. That shift alone removes the emotional edge from trade disputes. Intimidation only works when urgency exists. This approach also lowers risk. By spreading economic exposure across multiple partners, Canada reduces the damage any single dispute can cause. No one relationship carries absolute weight. No single leader can pull all the levers at once. That's why this visit matters. It signals that Canada is no longer hostage to one market, one corridor, or one political personality. It can engage calmly, push back selectively, and say no when needed, without triggering panic at home. This isn't escalation, it's insulation. And once a country builds that shield, pressure stops working the way it used to. Donald Trump can stand in front of reporters and say, Canada doesn't matter. He can dismiss trade relationships, waive off agreements, and insist the United States doesn't need its neighbors. But the events unfolding beyond Washington tell a very different story. A Canadian Prime Minister welcomed at the highest level in Beijing. Senior officials emphasizing reset, stability, and long-term cooperation. And a global economy quietly adjusting its expectations. These aren't coincidences, they are signals. Under Mark Carney, Canada isn't moving loudly or recklessly. It's moving deliberately. Step by step, it's reducing exposure to political volatility and rebuilding leverage through diversification. Not to provoke confrontation, but to prevent it. This is why the reaction from Donald Trump has felt so sharp. Pressure worked when Canada had no alternatives. Threats landed when dependence was real. That environment is fading. When options appear, intimidation loses its force and control becomes harder to maintain. What makes this moment different is its calm. There are no ultimatums, no dramatic declarations, no public breakups. Instead, Canada is quietly ensuring it never finds itself cornered again. Europe, Asia, and China aren't replacements for the United States. They are safeguards against overexposure.